All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about this young boy here who dies. So we'll look at the boy's death. Um, he's the son of Monsieur Othon, who is the town's prefect or mayor, or commissioner. And so the boy had the plague, and it was determined that there was very little that could be done for him. So the idea was to test out Dr. Castell's serum. So you can think of serum as some sort of vaccine or inoculation or something. It's the whole idea is you take an attenuated version of the plague, so a weakened version of the plague itself, the plague, um, I know bacteria, virus, or whatever it is, and you weaken it as much as you can, and then it's you inject it into someone's body, and the idea it's supposed to sort of stimulate the body's natural responses so that when the person does come in contact with the plague, um, their natural defenses are already activated, right? But you want it weak so that it doesn't. You're not basically giving someone the plague. Okay, so the idea was to test it on the boy since there was, you know, really at this point he could, he was almost going to die, so might as well test it on him and see if he'll get better or how he will react to it. All right, so they inject the boy uh, with serum, and so from page 213 on, we then begin to see what's happening with the boy, right? And we have this very graphic description that Camus goes through in showing of the boys suffering through the night and into the early morning. So I'm going to read some of this, but I just want to point out just all the people who were there. So we had Dr. Castell was present. Um, Joseph Braun was present. Let's see who else was there. You had Raymond Rambert who shows up. Um, Jean Tarou. And then, of course, Dr. Rieu's there. And Father Panilu. Okay, so the sort of six main characters in the book. Cotard's not there, but that's fine. Okay, so they all come in at different parts, and they watch the boy, right, trying to see how things are working. Okay, so the boy is in pain. He's twisting. He's sick, right, and he's not doing very well. So on page 214, right, you see this um, observation here. So it's about children dying, right? They say they had already seen children die for many months now. Death had showed no favoritism, right? So they had seen a lot of children die, but they had never yet watched a child's agony minute by minute. Okay, so that's the difference here, right? Is that they'd watched children die, but they'd never had to actually go through the process, the minute by minute, second by second process, as they were now, right? Um, the sort of thing a parent might have to do, right? It's as professionals that maybe come in and go from person to person, and then maybe there for the last moment, but they hadn't had to watch this process. Okay, so I'll read that paragraph in the middle of page 214. It says, they had already seen children die for many months. Now death had shown no favoritism, but they never had yet watched a child's agony minute by minute, as they had now been doing since daybreak. Needless to say, the pain inflicted on these innocent victims. Okay, so let's note the word here, innocent victims. All right, so we'll come back to an innocent victims. Surely that makes sense. They're a victim of the plague. The word innocent in itself, there's an interesting choice of words, so we'll come back to that. So, needless to say, the pain inflicted on these innocent victims had always seemed to them to be what in fact it was, an abominable thing, right? So, this idea that children dying is an abominable thing, right? just doesn't seem right. Okay. Right. So they go through watching the child having spasms, and they hear him scream, and he twists and has his convulsive tremors, and they see his frail frame bending, and he says it was as if his frail frame were bending before the fierce breath of the plague, breaking under the reiterated gusts of fever. So you can imagine what's going on with this child. It's pretty awful having to watch the child. Um, they talk about him. From beneath the inflamed eyelids, big tears welled up and trickled down the sunken, leaden-hued cheeks. So it's pretty gruesome, and they had been watching this child for hours. So now, as we get to the end of of this, we begin to see when it seems clear that this serum's not going to do anything for this child, and the child is going to die. Dr. Ryu goes up to the child, right, and on page 216. So at the top of page 16 says, only the child went on fighting with all his little might. So they were in a ward with a number of these um, the victims of the plague who were suffering. And this child was fighting death, right? Screaming and fighting against it. Now he goes on to say, now and then Ryu took his pulse, that's it took the child's pulse, less because this served any purpose than as an escape from his utter helplessness. And when he closed his eyes, he seemed to feel its tumult mingling with the fever of his own blood. And then, at one with the tortured child, he struggled to sustain him with all the remaining strength of his own body. But linked for a few minutes, the rhythm of the heartbeat soon fell apart. The child escaped him, and again he knew his impotence. Okay, so he knew his impotence. So impotence just means powerlessness. Okay, let's write that down. Powerless. So earlier we see him speak about his utter helplessness. Okay, and so he what we see Ryu trying to do is he in some ways trying to support this child, right? Trying to make him understand that there's people around him who love him and some way help him through this. And so he takes his pulse, he's trying to do something to, but all he's trying to just reveals his utter impotence. He's powerless basically in the face of this absurd suffering. So again, that's the thing about the child dying, right? Is that um, when you think of the elderly, dying versus so a child dying. Okay, there's something there that sort of bothers us, right? So we all know that it's sort of in the order of things that you grow older, you're getting closer to death, and at some point you will die, right? So when someone who's elderly dies, when they're at an advanced age, we think it's somewhat proper, right? It's sad, but it's in the natural course of things. But a child dying is not in the natural course of things, right? There's something absurd about a child dying. It's not the way it's supposed to be. And so that's what's going on here is that they're face to face with this thing that seems absurd, just abominable. It's not the right thing. And in the face of such evil, they're powerless and helpless. Okay, now on page 16, we begin to see the child suffering more and screaming and sort of twisting. Okay, and then he, in the middle of page or towards the end of page 216, says, in the small face, rigid as a mask of grayish clay, slowly the lips parted, and from them rose a long, incessant scream, hardly varying with his respiration and filling the word with a fierce, indignant protest, so little childish that it seemed like a collective voice issuing from all the sufferers there. Okay, so the child is beginning to scream, and it's this long scream, incessant. Now, so we look at the reaction of everyone there. So it goes on to say Ryu clenched his jaws. Okay. Taru looked away. Rambert went and stood beside Castel, who closed the book line on his knees. Right. So we've sort of accounted for uh, Castel, Rambert, Jean Taru, gritting his teeth. Joseph Grand had left. Okay. Ryu, Okay, so we saw him also the way he clenched his jaws, right? So in reaction to this suffering, we see what these people do. But there's one person left, who's Father Panelu. So while everyone's sort of reacting this way against the suffering, against this abominable sort of situation, right? Panelu, it says, Panelu gazed down at the small mouth fouled with the swords of the plague. Okay, so Panelu looks into the mouth of the plague, right? He goes face to face with it, right? Um, so he gazed down at the small mouth fouled with the swords of the plague, and pouring out the angry death cry that has sounded through the ages of mankind. Okay, so in this case, now we see that the child now represents, okay, humankind, right, and is screaming out this death cry that all human beings have forever, right? And we saw earlier that Dr. Rhea talked about death as shaping the order of life, the order of things. Okay, so what does Father Panelu do on bottom of page 216? It says, he sank on his knees, and all present found it natural to hear him say. Okay, so it was natural. So all present found it natural to hear him say, in the voice hoarse but clearly audible across that nameless, never-ending wail, my God, spare this child. Right, so we hear him pray, my God, spare this child. Okay, so this is the cry of the priest. Okay, it's the cry of faith, so in the face of suffering and evil. And it is a natural cry. Okay, that's a part. But everyone just felt like it fit, right? This was natural for him to cry out to God in this. Now, so note what he's doing. He's calling out to God to spare this child. Okay, so we note that here, that he's saying, spare this child, um, as though it was God who initiated the suffering, and God can make a choice and then spare the child. Okay, the text goes on to say, but the wail continued without cease, and other sufferers began to grow restless, right? And then I'll skip a couple of lines here. It says, a gust of sobs swept through the room, drowning Panelu's prayer. Okay, so the sobs, that's the cry of the sufferers, they drown out the prayer of faith. Okay, and Ryu, who was still tightly gripping the rail of the bed, shut his eyes, dazed with exhaustion and disgust. All right, so let's just think about this. So the man of faith calls out to God, but then the cries of the sufferers, right? The just that death cry drowns out the prayer of faith, right? So it's that seems to be the idea here, that it's the suffering is inevitable. It's natural to pray and cry out against the faith, against suffering, but um, that's as far as it goes. Well, so let's look at Dr. Ryu, who is the man of reason. So we've seen him introduced in this way earlier. His reaction is one of some physical discomfort. He's gripping the rail of the bed. He shuts his eyes. He doesn't want to see this, right? And he's dazed with exhaustion and disgust, right? So we can even see, just like faith is sort of drowned out here, reason, right, is exhausted, right? Let's, at this point, the reason is sort of exhausted. It doesn't really have the words to handle suffering. Okay, so what we're saying in some ways that with both faith, okay, and reason, right, in the face of evil slash suffering, okay, um, both seem to hit their limits. Okay, so that's sort of a way this book tends, at least this episode seems to be presenting this, right? That evil is this ultimate absurdity, and while both faith and reason are sort of natural expressions, they just seem to hit their limits here. All right. The text goes on to, but then suddenly the other sufferers fell silent, and now the doctor grew aware that the child's will, after weakening more and more, had fluttered out into silence. Um, Around him, the groans began again, but more faintly, like a far echo of the fight that was now over, for it was over. Okay, and so the child had died. Okay, so at this point, Dr. Ryu is frustrated and he walks out, and Father Panelu follows him. Okay. Now, so you have this sort of interesting situation here where um, so they have this discussion, and he says on page 218, "Come, doctor," he began. That's Father Panelu says to the doctor. Ryu swung around on him fiercely, so Ryu is upset. So let's just say Father P and Dr. Ryu, right? So we see Ryu upset, and so this is what Dr. Ryu says. He says that child was innocent. He says, and you know it as well as I do. Now, if you recall with Dr. Ryu, Dr. Ryu had made it clear that he didn't believe in God, right? And this was in response to Father Panelu's sermon. So if you recall, Father Panelu's sermon had begun that like this calamity, has come upon you, and you deserved it. Okay, so note the word "you deserved it," right? He's saying that God has let this happen, and you kind of deserve this. All right. Uh, so Dr. Ryu, in some way, is then pointing to Father Panelu, right? Who we see him had cried for God to spare the child. Okay, and he says that this child was innocent. So we brought up the word innocent already, right? And we see that innocent is, in a sense, juridical language, right? When we talk about innocent, we're talking about someone that doesn't deserve punishment, right? Someone who is not guilty, right? And so innocence has that sense about that. There's nothing bad here. This is good, and just the fact that this is the child is in a general sense innocent, right? So why is Dr. Ryu upset? Right? Why is he saying the child is innocent if he doesn't believe in God? Okay, so if he doesn't believe, excuse me, in God, why is he upset? Right? Because if he doesn't believe in God, then of course he wouldn't believe that God has anything to do with this, right? But either way, he still is upset, and he's pointing to Father Pandalou and saying, "This God you believe in, right? Look at what he did." So this is sort of an interesting thing that we should note here, which is that again, it's about the human response in the face of evil. Excuse me. So again, that just put this here that evil suffering is absurd, right? It's incomprehensible. That means when we see evil, it raises a question, and there's just no easy answer to it. Like, why is this child suffering? Why did this person have to die at such a young age? Why did, any number of things happen, right? Evil and suffering are just incomprehensible. They're absurd. They don't follow the order of things like you would expect. Okay, and so what's our response in the face of evil and suffering? Now we've seen part of that here, right? In when witnessing suffering. But we also see something with Dr. Ryu, which is that in some way, in order to come to terms with evil slash suffering, um, so we need God or something, okay, to pose our questions to. Right? So we need to be able, in some way, say, why did this happen? Right? If we're going to ask the question of why, like, why is this happening? We sort of need someone there, something, even if it's not God per se, but some kind of idea of something. That maybe I should say, we need the idea of God, okay? Or something like that to pose that question. So Dr. Ryu is actually angry, and this is his response that the child was innocent, and he's taking it out on the priest, but he shouldn't, right? Because he doesn't believe in God. But we see that's really the only way he can handle this. He does need the idea of God, right, to help him deal with this. And so Pope John Paul II does, excuse me, not the third, uh, bring something this up in his the Christian meaning of suffering, and that in the face of the absurdity of evil, of the chaos of evil, um, we sort of need this idea of God even to have some resolution, right? We need to be able to blame God for something, be angry at God, right? Or to thank God or something, but we need a receptacle for that's bigger than us, right? To be able to handle what we're feeling. Again, this is what we see with Dr. Ryu is that at this point he sort of comes against his own limits, right? That he can't, it's not enough to just simply try to process this. He needs to ask the bigger question, why did this happen, right? And that question needs um, the idea of God as a response. Okay, so one last point, the bottom of page 218, he says, Dr. Ryu says, no, Father, I have a very different idea of love, and until my dying day, I shall refuse to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture. Again, so note the language here is that the way he needs to talk about this, even as an atheist, is to make sense of this, is to say someone's responsible for this. And the only person that could be responsible is God, right? So he needs someone to be angry at. Otherwise, he would just have to accept that this was just some sort of random event. And that's sort of hard to deal with, to think that a child could die like that and it just means nothing. So what we see here is in some way this episode sort of highlights the idea that um, that belief in God, or in some way the idea of God, is almost somewhat of a necessary thing for us to be able to handle the absurdity of evil and suffering. So in the face of evil and suffering, the fact that we blame God, we're angry at God, or we're thankful to God, or however our response is, those things are completely natural, right? And that's because we just need something bigger than ourselves as a receptacle for what we're feeling, right? And so those are completely natural responses, and we see that with Dr. Rio.